Rain had begun in the black hours before dawn, and by the time the first gray light touched the battlement, it had become a steady, unrelenting veil. It slid down the slick faces of the towers, pooled in the grooves of worn stone, and clung to the banners like sorrow that would not lift. Beneath the weeping sky, Windsor Castle loomed a fortress of wet granite, its walls darkened by the storm. The Thames, swollen and restless, churned at its banks, its waters carrying the cold breath of the marsh and the smell of rotting reeds. Through the mist, procession emerged, a slow, measured line of riders cutting their way across the sodden earth. The horses' hooves sank deep into the mud, pulling free with wet, sucking sounds. Cloaks hung stiff and heavy with the weight of water, their edges dragging in the muck. Steam rose faintly from the beast's flanks, each exhale joining the pale clouds that curled from the riders' lips. At their head rode King John, his posture upright by will alone, his eyes shadowed by years of resistance, yet dimmed by the creeping weight of inevitability. The circlet upon his brow did not shine in the pale light. It sat like a chain, binding him to the moment he had tried for months to delay. Inside the great hall, the air was thick with the mingled scents of damp wool, burnt tallow, and the faint tang of steel. Puddles gathered beneath dripping cloaks. Boots tracked mud across the rush-covered floor. At the center, a heavy oaken table bore the weight of parchments, unfurled and waiting. The ink upon them still glistened under the wavering light of torches, curling faint wisps of smoke into the rafters. The scribes bent to their work in a rhythm, so steady it could have been mistaken for the beating of a clock if clocks had existed to mark such moments. Quills whispered across vellum, their tips scratching the bones of language into lines that might outlast the stones of Windsor itself. Every stroke was a quiet defiance of the notion that power could be eternal. In one man's hands, the barons stood in a half-circle, their faces carved in shadow and lit only by the orange glow of the torches. They said little, for there was no need. Words had been spent like coin in the months of negotiation and veiled threats. Now there was only presence and the heavy silence of men who had come not to beg, but to bind beneath their cloaks. Some fingers rested on dagger hilts, not in threat, but in habit, as though the feel of cold iron was a reminder that force was still an option if parchment failed. This was no haggling over rents or the return of stolen lands. This was the slow turning of the tide, a reckoning whispered not by shouting voices, but by the still, inexorable hand of necessity. It was the moment when kingship itself was weighed and found wanting. Outside, the rain washed the earth with an indifference that mocked both crown and charter. Beyond the walls, the low tolling of a church bell rolled through the mist, its sound swelling, thinning on the wind like a knell for the death of an old order. The king's eyes moved from face to face. He searched for cracks, a flicker of hesitation, the slight bend of a will that might yet be broken. But the barons met his gaze with the cold steadiness of men who had known too much of betrayal to falter now. Behind them stood generations of grievances, carried in silence and paid for in blood. Upon the table, the parchment waited. The seal lay beside it, dangling from its ribbon, the red wax glistening like a drop of blood, not yet cooled. To press it to the charter would be to admit a truth he had fought to deny, that the crown was no longer beyond the reach of the law. Somewhere deep in the chambers of his mind, a door shifted on its hinges. The opening was slight, just enough for a current of unfamiliar air to slip through. He could not yet tell if it carried the scent of salvation or the stench of his undoing. John reached for the seal, and the hall seemed to grow stiller. The rain outside softened, as though leaning in to listen. The torchlight danced in the pools of wax as the impression formed, a king's mark, irrevocable, once made. The ribbon trembled as if aware of its burden, and the wax cooled with a faint, almost imperceptible sigh. In that moment, the room did not erupt in triumph, nor in despair. Okay? It held only the quiet of an act completed, of a turning in the rivers. Of course, that would not be seen in full until years had passed. The scribes set down their quills. The barons did not smile. God, the king, did not bow. And yet, the air itself felt different, charged, as though the walls understood they had just witnessed the planting of a seed, whose roots would burrow deeper than any foundation stone. Outside, the bell tolled again. Its sound was slower now, heavier, as if each strike was marking not time, but consequence. The rain began to lift, leaving the meadow sodden and the banners limp, their colors dulled but still visible in the dim light. Somewhere downriver, the current carried away twigs, leaves, and unseen debris, the small, unnoticed fragments of a world that had just shifted. The king turned from the table, his cloak dragging through the mud at the threshold. Behind him, the parchment lay cooling, the ink settling into the skin of the vellum as though rooting itself in history. The barons did not move to follow. They would meet him again in council or in war, but for now, they let him walk alone. The door closed against the wind with a hollow thud, sealing the hall in its own echo. Far beyond Windsor's walls, in towns and manors where no one had yet heard of this day, the lives of men and women continued unchanged, yet the shadow of the seal already stretched toward them, unseen, like a storm still far on the horizon, and in that shadow lay the seeds of the next reckoning. The river's breath was cold that morning, curling low over the sodden grass like a ghost, reluctant to leave the earth. Beyond Windsor's stone shadow, the road wound east toward a wide meadow, a stretch of damp ground, pressed flat by the boots of armed men and the hooves of restless horses. Runnymede lay open to the wind, its edges softened by mist, its heart stamped with the weight of too many eyes fixed upon the same moment. The king arrived without herald's cry or trumpet. The sound of his party was swallowed by the wet hush, the muffled clop of hooves, the soft rattle of spurs, the dull groan of saddle leather swollen by rain. His cloak trailed dark ribbons of water, his crown hidden beneath a hood, for here, the gleam of gold was less a symbol of power than a target for resentment. The barons were already there, a wall of fur and mail standing between the king and the river. Some bore the marks of recent campaigning, a split knuckle, a crusted wound hidden poorly beneath a bandage. Others carried the stiffness of men who had stood too long in the damp. Their breath froze in the air as they watched the royal party dismount. Behind them, rows of soldiers stood at disciplined rest, shields leaning against their legs, banners sagging in the drizzle. Between the two camps stood a simple table, its legs half sunk in the wet ground. On it lay the charter, pinned at the corners by stones to keep the wind from lifting it away. The ink was dry now, but still deep and fresh, the Latin words marching down the vellum with the quiet certainty of law. Beside it, the royal seal hung. From its ribbon, no longer a choice, but a mark fixed to the day like a brand upon flesh. John's eyes moved over the assembly. These were not strangers. Many had feasted in his halls, sworn oaths in his presence, fought under his banners. Yet here they stood, bound together not by loyalty, but by a common need to chain the hand that had once led them. His jaw tightened, though his voice, when it came, was measured. "So be it," he said, the words dropping like stones into a well. A murmur passed through the ranks of barons, not loud enough to be called approval, but too alive to be mistaken for indifference. The charter was lifted carefully by a scribe whose hands trembled just enough to betray the moment's gravity. He turned toward the abbots and clerks who waited at the river's edge, their robes clinging to their knees, ready to carry copies of the document into every shire where its words might be read aloud in churches and marketplaces. A raven passed overhead, its cry sharp and solitary against a soft patter of rain. Some heads turned to follow it, for in these times every sign could be an omen. Was it a warning that the king's compliance was but a mask for future vengeance? Or was it a mark of witness, sealing the meadow's memory into the sky? The wind shifted, carrying the scent of wood smoke from the distant camps where lesser men waited for the outcome. Squires, servants, cooks, tending fires that smoked more than they burned in the wet air. Life beyond this table went on, though it now carried the weight of what had been signed. The king did not linger. His departure was slow, deliberate, each step through the mud a statement of endurance. The barons did not follow. They remained by the table, speaking in low tones, the damp wool of their cloaks steaming faintly as the rain eased. Somewhere, a bell tolled from the far bank, its sound thin with distance, yet clear enough to pierce the marrow, when the king's retinue vanished into the fog. Runnymede was left to the silence of the river and the flutter of wet banners. Charter lay in its chest, bound in leather, ready to be carried into a world that would test every line it bore. No one here could know how quickly some promises would be broken, nor how long the echo of this day would ring. The mist thickened as the barons began to disperse, their silhouettes swallowed one by one. Soon the meadow was almost empty, save for a lone monk standing by the water's edge, his eyes on the current. He watched as a fallen leaf spun in an eddy, was caught, and then pulled under dot by nightfall. The rain returned, softer now, almost tender, as though the sky itself sought to blur the sharp edges of the day. But the seal in the king's handprint would not fade, and neither would the quiet, dangerous knowledge that the crown had bent somewhere in a drought-filled hall, yet untouched by the news. A child slept beneath a woolen blanket, dreaming of knights and banners. He could not know that the laws shaping his life had just been written in a meadow he would never see dot, and beyond the horizon, the threads of rebellion still smoldered, waiting for the wind. The road from Runnymede was a ribbon of mud, dark and glistening under the weight of fresh rain. The hoofprints of the king's departure had already begun to fill with water, each one a small mirror catching the gray of the sky. The riders moved in single file, their armor muffled beneath sodden cloaks, their breaths misting into the cold air. The meadow lay behind them like an afterimage, too real to be a dream, yet too strange to feel like the ordinary business of a king. John rode, without speaking. His head was bowed, not in humility, but in thought, the hood of his cloak drawn low, so the rain traced his cheeks in thin, cold streams. To those riding behind, he looked like a man subdued by defeat. But in the shadows of his mind, other shapes moved. He turned the day's events over in silence, studying them as one studies an enemy's fortifications, seeking the hidden cracks. By the time the party reached Windsor, the light had fallen to the bruised colors of dusk. Walls loomed ahead, wet stone swallowing the torchlight at its gates. The king passed beneath the portcullis without a word to the guards, his horse's hooves echoing sharply on the cobbles before being swallowed by the damp hush of the inner court. Inside the great chamber, the fire burned low, throwing long, uneven shadows against the carved beams. The scent of wet wool and horse clung to the air, mingling with a faint tank of smoke. Servants moved quietly, their eyes lowered, for they could sense the tautness in the king's silence. John removed his cloak, the fabric falling heavy into a servant's arms, and approached the fire. For a long moment, he stood with one hand resting on the mantle, watching the flames twist and break. "They think this is done," he said at last, his voice low but edged with steel. "They think a king's word is a chain." A man stepped forward from the shadows, Peter de Roches, Bishop of Winchester, the king's steadfast ally. His robes smelled faintly of incense, though the journey had dulled their sanctity. Chains can be broken, sire, he replied softly, especially those forged in meadows. John's eyes flicked toward him, the firelight catching in their dark depths. Yes, broken or burned. The chamber filled with the quiet hiss of the fire. Outside, rain spattered against the shuttered windows, a sound steady enough to mask the small movements of those present. A scribe, adjusting his inkpot, a knight, resting his hand on the pommel of his sword. The air felt thicker here, as though the walls themselves had begun to lean in. Listening by morning letters would leave Windsor in all directions, not proclamations to honor the charter, but secret summons to mercenary captains in Flanders. In Poitou, coal would flow quietly into the hands of men who owed nothing to the barons of England. Ships would be prepared, and oaths whispered in candlelit corners. Each one a thread in a net the barons could not yet see tightening. Yet, to the world beyond the castle gates, the king wore the mask of peace. Messengers carried word of the great settlement at Runnymede, and in villages and manors the news was met with cautious hope. Priests spoke of justice in their sermons. Merchants imagined a steadier coinage. Villains dreamed, faintly, of relief from their burdens. Few knew that a document, no matter how noble its script, could not change the heart of a king determined to undo it. That night, John dined in his private hall. The meal was modest by royal measure: roasted capon, trenchers of dark bread, and a flagon of Gascon wine whose deep red clung to the sides of the cup like blood to a blade. He ate in slow silence, the flicker of the candles casting shadows like bars across the table. Every so often, his gaze drifted to the great seal lying on the table beside him. It gleamed faintly, a reminder of the hand he had been forced to play, and the hand he still intended to keep hidden. Beyond Windsor, the roads grew dark. In the low fields, the Thames crept over its banks, swallowing reeds and meadow grasses alike. The same rain that had washed Runnymede was now turning the land into a slow-moving mirror, reflecting the faint, cold stars. Somewhere in the dark, the hoofbeats of a lone rider echoed over the waterlogged ground, carrying words the barons were never meant to hear. And so the king's silence deepened, not the silence of defeat, but of a man waiting for the right moment to strike. Far to the north, in the drafty halls of baronial keeps, men warmed their hands over fires, believing the day at Runnymede had marked the end of the struggle. But the wind outside told a different truth. It whispered through the cracks in the shutters, slipped into the rushes on the floor, and wound its way into dreams, a restless, unseen warning that the peace was already dying. The king had bent, but he had not broken, and when the breaking came, it would not be in a meadow, but on fields where rain could not wash the blood away. Winter's edge clung to the land, though the calendar swore it was spring. A cold wind dragged itself over the fields, bending the bare branches of ash and oak, stirring the waters of the Thames until they glimmered like black glass. Along the roads, travelers wrapped themselves in cloaks patched with old campaign cloth, their breath spilling in pale clouds as they passed shrines where candles guttered in the draught. In the halls of the great lords, the talk was still of Runnymede, spoken in tones that mixed relief with suspicion. The charter had been read aloud in churches, its clauses heard by those who had never before imagined the law could name a king as its subject. Peasants repeated snatches of it at market stalls, their hands busy with sacks of grain and salted fish, not knowing which words were truth and which had been bent in the telling. But in baronial chambers, where the tapestries muffled the wind and the wine was poured heavy, the lord's new peace was fragile. A king who had sworn under duress was a king who dreamed of vengeance. At Windsor, those dreams were already taking shape. The king's council had grown smaller, tighter, tier Its meetings held not in the echoing great hall, but in the chamber where the walls were hung with heavy drapes to muffle sound. Here, by candlelight, John spread maps across the table, the coastlines of Normandy, the harbors of Flanders, the ridges and valleys of his own realm. Pins marked ports where loyal men could land with foreign troops. Beside them lay letters written in his own sharp hand, sealed in wax, and bound for captains whose loyalty was measured not in honor, but in gold. Ships waited in harbors along the channel, their hulls creaking against the tide. Flemish crossbowmen drilled in quiet yards behind shuttered inns. Quite thin knights sharpened their blades in rooms where the hearth had burned down to coals. All this gathered strength moved like a shadow felt but not yet seen. In the north, a baron named Robert Fitzwalter sat in his keep, staring into the flames. The news from the south was troubling. Royal agents had been seen on the roads, riding under false colors. Grain was being bought in bulk, not to feed the hungry, but to feed an army. Even the abbots whispered of coin flowing from the treasury into foreign hands. Fitzwalter's fingers tightened on the arms of his chair. He knew the king too well to mistake such signs for chance. Meanwhile, John played the role of a man chastened. He attended mass with solemnity, distributed alms to the poor, and nodded gravely when the charter's clauses were spoken in his presence. But behind closed doors, his voice was sharper, his movements quicker. He was a man laying stones for a bridge no one else could yet see, a bridge that would carry him over the limits placed upon him and deposit him once more in the unbound lands of absolute rule. The first open breach came quietly. A messenger sent north to deliver the king's commands arrived in the dead of night at the gates of a baron's manor. The letter within bore no mention of the charter, only demands for levies and service, as though Runnymede had never been. By morning, the baron's household was alive with anger. The servants whispering as armor was polished, and old war banners pulled from the chests where they had slept since the last rebellion. Storm clouds thickened over the realm, though the skies above remained deceptively clear. Markets bustled, bells rang for feast days, and lambs were born in the fields. But beneath this, men tested the edges of their swords, counted their allies, and listened to the wind. The smell of wood smoke carried a taste of something older, the memory of burned villages, the sharp tang of fear that comes before battle. One evening, as the sun bled out across the horizon, John stood alone on Windsor's ramparts. The river below caught the dying light, running red and gold toward the sea. In his hand, he turned the great seal, feeling its weight in his palm. The wax from Runnymede might have cooled, but here, in his grasp, the true authority still lay. Far below, a single torch flared to life in the castle yard, the signal for a rider to depart. Hoofs clattered against the stones, fading into the dark. The orders he carried would not be read in the king's courts, nor recorded in the realm's ledgers. They were meant only for those who understood that the time for waiting was ending. The wind off the Thames cut cold across the battlements, tugging at the king's cloak. He let it pull at him, feeling the strength of it, the bite. War was not yet declared, but it was coming. He could smell it in the damp air, hear it in the restless murmur of the river, and when it came, it would wash away more than the ink at Runnymede. The summer came heavy and wet, the kind of heat that made the air taste of iron and rain. In the hedgerows, bees swarmed over white blossom, but the hum of their wings was drowned beneath the louder murmur, the thrum of hooves on the old Roman roads, the rattle of harness, the hollow knock of pikes against cart sides. The king had cast off the mask. Couriers no longer carried letters of courtesy to the barons. They carried summons written like threats. Garrisons were reinforced not for defense, but for siege. The charter's parchment still lay in the royal chest, but no priest dared speak its clauses in John's hearing. When one did, in a church south of London, The king's men rode through the nave at dusk, trampling the rushes beneath their horses' hooves, their mail clinking in the candlelight. The priest's body was found the next morning in the river, his hands bound with the cord from his own cassock. In the east, the first sparks caught. Gay manor, loyal to Fitzwalter, refused the king's levy, its gates barred against the royal officer. The officer returned with 50 men, torches in hand, and by dawn the house was ash and smoke, its well filled with rubble so no one could drink there again. The smell carried for miles, mingling with the scent of ripening wheat. By autumn, England was a land of embers and whispers. Messengers galloped by night between rebel strongholds, Rochester, Lincoln, Northampton, bearing tidings written in a cipher of saints' names and feast days. In the shadows of the barns, men strapped on old helmets dented from crusade battles, their eyes hardened by the memory of the king's treachery. At Dover, the sea was restless. Foreign sails appeared against the horizon, first in 2s and 3s, then in fleets. Flemish mercenaries came ashore with their crossbows wrapped in oilcloth, Poitvin knights with their shields painted in strange colors. John met them in the salt wind, speaking to them not in the measured words of a monarch, but in the clipped urgency of a man who had no time left for diplomacy. Gold changed hands as quickly as oaths. The rebels struck first at London. Its gates swung open to them, under cover of darkness, not by force, but by sympathy. The city had felt the king's taxes, the weight of his fines, the cold disregard for his charters. Now, the bells rang in the dark, not for mass, but for war. By morning, the royal banners had been torn down from the Guildhall, trampled in the mud outside. John's fury was a private thing, coiled and silent. He did not rage in public, but his orders grew sharper, more merciless. When he rode north to lay siege to Rochester Castle, it was not with the slow dignity of a campaign, but with the hungry speed of a predator. The castle's walls were thick, its gatehouse strong, but the king's engineers brought fire, boiling water, and the slow grind of siege engines. The stench of burning fat clung to the air where war machines had been greased. In the river Medway ran sluggish with debris. Inside, the defenders held for weeks, eating the last of their salted meat, drinking rainwater caught in barrels on the wall. Outside, John paced beneath the shadow of the keep, his cloak snapping in the wind, waiting for the stone to break. When it did, he gave no quarter. Prisoners were chained, dungeons filled, and the smoke from the ruined gatehouse could be seen for miles. But the victory did not end the war. For every stronghold John took, another rose against him. The kingdom was no longer a map of loyalty and rebellion. It was a field of shifting shadows. Alliances traded like coin, oaths broken before the wax could cool on the seal, and all the while the charter remained silent, locked in its coffer, its words powerless against the clamor of steel. The promise that the king would be bound by law had become a memory, as fragile as a candle flame in a draught, far from the battle lines. In the cloister of a monastery untouched by the fighting, a young monk copied the text of the charter into his own hand. He wrote by lamplight, the ink shining wet on the vellum, unaware that outside these walls, the England for which it had been written was already vanishing into smoke. Winter's breath came early, blowing in from the channel with the taste of salt and snow. The harbors along the southern coast were restless masts swayed against the gray horizon, ropes thrummed in the wind, and the gulls cried over a sea thick with ships. Not English ships. In the dim candlelight of Dover Castle's war room, John stood over a map, his fingers pressing hard into the parchment, as if he could hold the kingdom together by force of will alone. A whisper had become a certainty. Prince Louis of France was coming. The rebel barons, exhausted by the king's sieges and broken promises, had sent for him in secret, offering him the English crown in return for their salvation. The betrayal was not in the rebellion, That wound was old, but in the thought of foreign feet upon English soil, foreign tongues in English halls. Still, the king had no time for mourning. Orders flew like arrows from Dover to York, walls to be repaired, grain to be seized, horses to be kept ready night and day. But the rebellion fed itself on desperation. London, still under rebel control, became the beating heart of resistance. Within its timbered halls, barons swore their oaths to Louis by the glow of rushlight, their hands resting on gospel books as the frost formed white flowers upon the leaded glass. Messengers rode to the coast to prepare for the prince's landing. When Louis came in the spring, it was with the fleet that plotted the horizon, sails like pale ghosts against the stormlight. Men poured ashore at Thanet, the clatter of Potney, the clatter of their arms ringing across the shingle. Behind them came siege towers dismantled for the voyage. Great beams of oak hauled by sweating men and lowing oxen. John, moving swiftly through the countryside, struck like a knife where he could, burning towns that had given the rebels shelter, seizing supplies before they could reach Louis. Yet his strength was fraying. The French advance was steady. The rebels' cause newly rekindled. Even his own captains looked at him with eyes that measured his crown's worth in days, not years. At Winchester, the bells tolled not for mass, but for surrender. The French marched in with their fleur-de-lis banners unfurled, their polished helms reflecting the pale light. In the north, castles fell one by one, their garrisons too thin to resist. England's spine seemed to bend beneath the weight of two masters. Still, John did not yield. He rode through the night more than once, wrapped in a sodden cloak, his breath steaming in the cold. Witnesses said he spoke little in those days, but his eyes were fierce, and he carried his seal with him always, as if the kingdom itself was bound in that small, engraved circle of metal. It was disease that struck first, not the sword. Crossing the tidal estuary near the Wash, the king's baggage train was swallowed by the sea treasure, relics, arms all lost to the sucking mud. In the damp weeks that followed, John fell ill. The fever took him quickly, leaving him pale and trembling in the torchlight. At Newark, he took the sacrament with shaking hands, the bread crumpling between his fingers. Witnesses say he spoke of his son, Henry, and of the kingdom he would leave behind, but not of the charter. Perhaps it was too bitter a memory or too far gone to save. When John died in October 1216, the land was not at peace. Louis still held London. The rebel barons still kept the field. In the Magna Carta, the great promise that law might bind the crown lay once more in the hands of those who would reshape it. Far from the death chamber in the scriptorium of St. Albans, the monk who had copied the charter months before laid down his quill. He could hear the winter wind through the cloister arches, and for a moment he thought it sounded like distant bells, not for mourning, not for victory, perhaps for the faint, stubborn heartbeat of an idea that refused to die. Years passed, and the ink upon the charter faded, catches curled, wax seals cracked, and the names of men, kings, barons, scribes were spoken less in the halls of power and more in the whispers of cloisters. Henry, the boy king, crowned in the shadow of his father's failures, swore to uphold the charter once more. Yet promises are fragile things in the hands of rulers. The wars did not cease, the taxes did not vanish, and the peasants still bent their backs beneath the weight of lords who seldom looked them in the eye. Still, something had changed in the cold stone rooms where records were kept. Copies of the Magna Carta multiplied in parchment and ink. It took root. No longer just a truce between warring men, it began to seep into the bones of the realm, into the sermons of priests, into the judgments of sheriffs, into the memory of those who had seen kings kneel. Centuries would pass before the world called it by name again, Before its words crossed seas, before they found their way into the laws of lands the barons had never dreamed of. But the seed had been planted. Its blight, if tended by time, can split stone. In the great library of Lincoln, where one of the surviving charters still rests, the parchment lies under glass. The ink is faded, the letters worn. Yet, when you stand before it, the hall seems to hush. You can almost hear the rain against Windsor's towers, the scrape of quills on oak, the toll of a single bell in the mist. Perhaps that is the true power of history, that it speaks not only of what was, but of what could be again. If you have journeyed with us through this tale, through rain and fire, crown and betrayal, then stand with us still. Let the story travel farther, carried by your hands. Share it so others may hear the whisper of the parchment. Subscribe so you will be here when the next chapter of history's shadow is told, and keep the bell of memory tolling for as long as there are ears to hear.